We're talking about the heir to the throne. It's a world-famous school. He would be mixing with the great and the good of all over the world, the children of people from all over the world.
The account suggests that she felt insulted and deeply hurt. For someone at the center of the royal family, being challenged by a child in such a personal way could be difficult enough. But the situation became more serious because William was there, and his response did not fit the outcome Camilla might have expected. William reportedly remained protective of Charlotte's right to understand her family history in her own way. That does not mean he was openly attacking Camilla. It does not mean he wanted a confrontation. His position, as described in the account, was quieter and more difficult to challenge. A child should not necessarily be ordered to use an emotionally significant title simply because adults expect it. That silence from William carried its own message. Camilla could have viewed Charlotte's words as a moment that needed to be corrected immediately. William could have treated the incident as a minor misunderstanding, but neither response would erase what had already been said. The word was out. Charlotte had made her choice clear, at least according to the story. And now the question became whether the adults would respect it or try to reverse it. Then the situation moved beyond the family gathering. That was the point when the stakes changed. A private disagreement inside a family can be contained. A disagreement that begins moving through palace staff becomes something else. Every retelling adds interpretation. Every whisper creates another version. Soon, what began with one child's refusal can become a question about family loyalty, public image, and the place of a grandmother whose memory remains powerful inside the next generation. According to the account, Charles became increasingly concerned when he learned that the incident was spreading through the household. His concern was not simply about Charlotte's words, it was about what those words represented and what they might mean if the disagreement continued. The expectation surrounding Charles was straightforward. He was Camilla's husband, he was Charlotte's grandfather. He was also the person with the authority to bring an uncomfortable royal family situation under control. If he wanted the matter ended quickly, one instruction could have done it. Charlotte could be asked to apologize. William could be told to intervene. Staff could be reminded that Camilla should be treated with a particular title inside the household. But the account takes a different turn. Charles did not immediately confront Charlotte. He did not reportedly summon Camilla into a public argument. Instead, he summoned William for a confidential conversation. There was also a quiet emotional pressure surrounding the moment that could not be seen from the outside.
Of whose talents, traditions, and achievements I am so inexpressibly proud, have prospered and flourished. Our values have remained, and must remain, constant.
Charlotte was growing up inside a family where names and titles carried unusual meaning. A simple word could connect generations, while another word could create distance. For most children, family names are instinctive. Inside the royal family, they can become symbols. That is why the reported exchange deserves attention beyond the shock of the headline. The issue was not simply whether Charlotte liked Camilla, it was whether adults would allow a child to hold her own understanding of a complicated family story without turning that understanding into a command. Camilla's position was equally complicated. Being accepted by the younger generation matters, particularly when the relationship is already surrounded by decades of public discussion. A rejection from Charlotte could therefore feel like more than a child's preference. It could feel like a reminder that some old divisions had never fully disappeared. William stood between those two realities. He had to protect his daughter without turning the moment into a larger battle. He also had to navigate his father's authority and Camilla's feelings. One wrong response could make the incident far more serious. And somewhere above all of them was the memory of Diana. Her name did not need to be spoken constantly for her presence to be felt. Charlotte's reported words had already brought that memory into the room. That was the uncomfortable truth beginning to emerge. The family was no longer dealing with a child's choice of words. They were dealing with what that choice appeared to awaken in everyone else. And behind closed doors, Charles was about to decide whether the wound would remain buried. That detail is where the atmosphere changes again. William now had to walk into a meeting without knowing whether his father intended to defend Camilla, reprimand him, or demand that Charlotte change what she had said. And there was another possibility that few people around them would have considered. Perhaps Charles was not angry because Charlotte had refused to call Camilla her grandmother. Perhaps he was angry because her words had touched something he had spent years trying not to confront. The distinction matters. If Charles simply wanted obedience, the solution would have been easy. Correct the child, protect the title, close the matter. But if Charlotte's words had forced Charles to confront an old emotional wound, then the disagreement could not be solved by an apology. That is the question hanging over the private meeting. What exactly did Charles hear when Charlotte spoke? Did he hear a child refusing a title? Or did he hear the echo of a family history that had never completely disappeared? For William, the answer would matter. For Camilla, it could be deeply personal. And for Charles, according to the allegation at the center of this story, it would become a moment of unexpected reflection. Because the most surprising part had not happened yet. William was about to hear what Charles really wanted from him. And if the expectation was that Charlotte would be forced to apologize, the next decision would turn that expectation upside down. Stay with this story, because the next part gets worse for everyone involved, and Charles's private decision is where the real family conflict begins. The door closed behind William, and whatever Charles had planned to say was now between father and son alone. This was the moment when the argument stopped being about a title and became a question of authority. William had already understood that Charlotte's words had consequences. What he did not yet know was whether his father intended to protect the family hierarchy or protect the child's right to define her own relationship.
But it's hugely prestigious for whoever lands the future king, isn't it?
Charles reportedly began by asking William to explain exactly what had happened. Not the palace version, not the softened version that staff might repeat. He wanted to hear William's account directly. That distinction mattered because rumors had already begun filling the gaps between what Charlotte said and what people believed she meant. William's response, according to the account, was measured. He did not portray Charlotte as deliberately disrespectful. He did not accuse Camilla of doing anything wrong. He focused on the child's understanding of her family and the emotional importance attached to Diana. In that framing, Charlotte was not rejecting a person as much as rejecting a label that did not feel natural to her. That answer placed Charles in a difficult position. If he treated the matter as simple royal etiquette, the solution would be immediate. Charlotte would be corrected, the household would move on, and Camilla would receive reassurance. But William's explanation raised another issue. How much authority should adults exercise over a child's private feelings? That question was especially sensitive because Charlotte was not an ordinary child living outside public scrutiny. Every family interaction involving her could eventually become part of a much larger public narrative. A word spoken casually could be repeated by staff, interpreted by relatives, and transformed into a story about the future of the monarchy. Camilla reportedly wanted the matter handled with dignity. Her hurt was understandable within the account because the title she had expected to occupy in the family had been challenged by one of the youngest members of it. Yet demanding recognition would create another problem. If Charlotte were forced to use a title she did not associate with Camilla, the word might be spoken, but the feeling behind it could not be commanded. That distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. William reportedly understood this better than anyone in the room. He had spent years living with the consequences of public arguments about his parents. He knew that children often inherit the emotional consequences of conflicts they did not create. Charlotte's generation had not witnessed those events firsthand, but it could still inherit the stories, photographs, memories, and loyalties surrounding them. That was why William's position carried more weight than a simple disagreement between a father and a son. He was deciding what kind of family environment his daughter would grow up in. Would she be expected to repeat the language adults preferred? Or would she be allowed to develop her own understanding of people whose places in her family history were already complicated? According to the story, William chose the second approach. That did not mean he wanted Camilla humiliated. It did not mean he wanted Diana's memory used as a weapon. And it did not mean he was trying to turn Charlotte against anyone. His reported position was narrower and more personal. Charlotte should not be forced to manufacture an emotional connection simply because the palace considered a particular title appropriate. That was precisely what made the situation dangerous. Inside a royal household, personal choices can become institutional questions very quickly. Camilla's supporters could see the episode as disrespect. Those sympathetic to William could see it as a father defending his daughter. Those focused on Charlotte could see it as a child expressing her own understanding. And those who remembered Diana could see something much larger. Each interpretation pulled the family in a different direction. Then another problem emerged. People inside the household reportedly began asking what would happen at future family occasions. If Charlotte encountered Camilla again, would staff introduce her differently? Would someone quietly remind her what title to use? Would William intervene? Would Charles insist that the matter be settled before another gathering? Those questions mattered because the disagreement could no longer be solved simply by waiting for everyone to forget it. A palace aide, according to the account, was aware that the issue was becoming sensitive. Staff had to be careful around family members, especially when a private disagreement involved a child. Any attempt to coach Charlotte could be interpreted as pressure. Any refusal to guide her could be interpreted as disrespect toward Camilla. The household was caught between two competing ideas of family order. One demanded consistency, the other demanded personal choice. And Charlotte had unintentionally become the point where those ideas collided. The more the adults discussed the matter, the less simple it became. If Charles defended Camilla too strongly, he risked making Charlotte feel that her feelings were less important than an adult title. If he supported Charlotte openly, he risked deepening Camilla's sense of rejection. If William fought too hard for his daughter, the disagreement could become a larger confrontation between father and son. There was no painless option. Charles reportedly did not answer immediately. That silence became important because William was watching for the smallest sign of what his father intended. A quick instruction would have ended the uncertainty. Instead, the conversation reportedly remained focused on the principle behind Charlotte's choice. The account suggests Charles considered the wider consequences. If palace staff began correcting Charlotte every time she used a different form of address, the household could create the very conflict it was trying to prevent. A private preference could become a daily confrontation. Every family gathering could carry the expectation of another correction. Charlotte could begin associating ordinary family encounters with pressure. That possibility made the situation more serious. Charles also understood that William would have to live with whatever decision came next. This was not a distant administrative problem that could be handed to staff. It involved his son, his granddaughter, and his wife. Any order would have consequences inside the family. William reportedly left the meeting without the clear instruction he had expected. That uncertainty was significant. Camilla still wanted the matter resolved. Charlotte still had her position. William still stood behind her, and Charles had not yet revealed where he stood. Outside the room, the household waited for a signal. Staff did not know whether they should reinforce the traditional form of address or avoid the subject altogether. The longer the uncertainty lasted, the more people began to wonder whether Charles was preparing to issue an order that could surprise everyone. And nobody around expected it. Then came the question that changed William's understanding of the meeting. Charles reportedly asked whether William believed Charlotte should ever be pressured to use the title. William's answer was the kind that leaves little room for compromise. According to the account, he believed she should not be forced. That was the point where Charles had to choose what mattered more: obedience to expectation or freedom within the family. The significance of that choice was not lost on William. For years, royal families have depended on rules, ceremony, titles, and carefully managed appearances. But a child does not experience family through protocol alone. A child experiences it through memory, affection, familiarity, and the people she feels connected to. Charlotte's reported decision had exposed that difference, and it had exposed something else. Camilla could be accepted formally while still being understood differently by individual members of the family. No public announcement could change that. No palace instruction could guarantee affection. A title could be requested, it could be repeated, but it could not be forced into existence emotionally. That reality made the dispute far more uncomfortable than anyone had expected. There was also a risk that Charlotte's words would be interpreted as a statement about Diana's continuing place within the family. That interpretation could reopen arguments that had been quiet for years. The story surrounding Diana remained emotionally powerful, and any suggestion that her memory was being displaced could provoke strong reactions. William therefore had another reason to remain careful. He was not simply protecting Charlotte from pressure, he was also preventing a private family disagreement from becoming a public battle over Diana's legacy. But the pressure was already building. Camilla reportedly believed the matter needed recognition. William believed Charlotte needed room. Charles had both positions in front of him, and now the final decision was his. If you think Charlotte's voice should matter more than palace pressure, do not scroll away and pretend this does not matter. Subscribe, share this story, and leave your support in the comments, because the next decision Charles was about to make would put Camilla, William, and the entire household in an even more difficult position. Stay with it, because what came next was far more serious than a family disagreement. The next decision was no longer sitting in the room with William, it was moving toward the people who would have to carry it out. Charles had listened, questioned, and remained guarded, but he had not yet given the answer everyone was waiting for. That uncertainty created a dangerous pause inside the household.
I've read that there've been some changes at Eton, but maybe those are coincidental. They have nothing to do with the fact that Prince George could be joining. Like I read recently, although someone did tell me that it was something old, that they've banned mobile phones.
Oh yeah.
Which I think that's a very Prince William thing to do.
William understood that silence could mean several things. His father might still decide that Charlotte had crossed a line. He might decide that Camilla's position required protection. Or he might take the matter in a direction neither side had anticipated. Until Charles spoke, nobody could know. For William, the most important issue was no longer the title itself. It was what happened after the title was refused. If Charlotte was immediately corrected, she would learn that certain feelings were unacceptable. If she was left alone, the adults would have to accept that family relationships could not always be controlled from above. That was a difficult lesson inside a family built around protocol. According to the account, Charles understood that distinction. The reported discussion with William therefore became less about Charlotte's behavior and more about what the adults intended to do next. Charles reportedly wanted to know whether William had considered how the situation could affect Camilla. William's answer was careful. He could acknowledge Camilla's feelings without surrendering Charlotte's choice. Those two positions did not have to cancel each other out. A child could be protected without another family member being deliberately humiliated. That balance was becoming harder to maintain. Camilla, meanwhile, was reportedly facing an uncomfortable reality. No instruction from palace staff could guarantee that Charlotte would suddenly feel differently. Even if the correct title were repeated every time they met, repetition would not create affection. It could only create compliance. That distinction mattered, because the reported conflict was personal rather than ceremonial. The household therefore faced a choice that had no perfect answer. Staff could encourage Charlotte to use the expected title, they could avoid correcting her, or they could wait for Charles to establish a clear rule. Each option carried a different risk. The third option was the one everyone was waiting for. Charles had the authority to settle the matter, but settling it would also reveal his priorities. If he defended Camilla, William would have to decide whether to challenge his father's position. If he protected Charlotte, Camilla could feel that her place within the family had been weakened. There was no way to make everyone comfortable. That was why the next conversation mattered so much. According to the story, Charles did not treat Charlotte's refusal as an isolated childish incident. He reportedly saw how quickly the issue could become symbolic. The name Diana remained attached to the disagreement, and that made the situation more emotionally charged than an ordinary dispute over manners. William knew that better than most. He had no reason to turn Charlotte's words into an attack on Camilla, but he also had no reason to erase Charlotte's understanding of Diana simply to make an uncomfortable room feel calmer. That position placed him in a delicate space between two generations. Charles represented the authority of the present institution. Charlotte represented a younger generation growing up with a different relationship to the family's past. William stood between them, carrying memories of the past while trying to protect his daughter from becoming trapped inside it. Then Charles reportedly asked the question that exposed the real problem. What would happen if Charlotte continued to use her own choice of address? There was no easy answer. William reportedly maintained that she should not be forced. If Charlotte eventually changed her mind naturally, that would be different. But pressure could turn a family relationship into an obligation. Charles now had to decide whether that principle could be accepted inside the royal household. The answer would affect more than one conversation. It could influence how staff addressed Charlotte around Camilla. It could determine how future family gatherings were handled. It could even shape whether the disagreement disappeared quietly or became an enduring source of tension. And the longer Charles waited, the greater the anticipation became. Camilla reportedly wanted reassurance that the incident had not changed her standing. William wanted assurance that his daughter would not be pressured. Charles had to find a position between those demands. But there was another layer. The story surrounding the incident suggested that Charles's own history made Charlotte's words difficult for him to dismiss. Her refusal reportedly brought Diana back into a conversation where Diana was not physically present. That alone could explain why the matter carried more emotional force than its size suggested. Yet Charles had spent years living with the consequences of decisions surrounding his first marriage. The past could not simply be rewritten because the next generation had grown up. Charlotte's understanding of Diana was part of the family story, whether anyone wanted to revisit it or not. That did not make Camilla an outsider. It did not make Charlotte responsible for old conflicts. And it did not make William an enemy of his father's wife. It simply meant that the family was dealing with several truths at the same time. Camilla wanted acceptance. Charlotte wanted authenticity. William wanted protection for his daughter. Charles wanted control over a situation that was beginning to escape control. Those competing needs were now heading toward a single decision. The atmosphere inside the household reportedly became more cautious. Staff could sense that the family wanted the matter handled privately. Conversations became shorter. People avoided unnecessary comments. The safest approach was to say less, because every sentence could be repeated differently by the next person who heard it. That is how a small private incident can become a palace controversy, not through one dramatic announcement, but through uncertainty. People begin guessing, they begin interpreting silence, they begin asking who is angry, who is protected, and who has been told to stay quiet. The same process was now surrounding Charlotte, and there was one question nobody could answer yet. Would Charles require her to change? If he did, the conflict would probably end on the surface. But beneath that surface, Charlotte could learn that the palace had chosen protocol over personal feeling. If he did not, Charles would be sending a very different message. He would be acknowledging that even inside the royal family, there were limits to how far an adult could control the language of a child. That was a significant principle. The reported order was still unknown, but its consequences were already taking shape. If Charles chose restraint, he would be doing more than ending an argument. He would be establishing a boundary around Charlotte's personal choices. That boundary could protect her from pressure, but it could also leave Camilla feeling that the family had quietly accepted the rejection. For Camilla, that possibility was difficult. Recognition within a family cannot be separated from emotion. A formal position may be secure, yet a personal relationship can remain complicated. Charlotte's reported refusal exposed that difference in the most uncomfortable way possible. For William, the coming decision carried another responsibility. Whatever Charles ordered, William would still have to guide Charlotte afterward. He would have to make sure that she understood neither anger nor guilt belonged on her shoulders, simply because adults had reacted strongly to her words. That made the next step crucial. The issue was no longer whether Charlotte had spoken. She had. The issue was no longer whether Camilla had been hurt. She had reportedly been. The issue was what Charles would do with both facts. And now, for the first time, the entire household was waiting for one answer. It also carried a personal cost. Camilla could reasonably feel wounded by it. William could feel relieved by it. Charlotte might never understand the full significance of it. Charles alone had to absorb all three consequences. According to the account, he finally reached his decision. But he did not announce it in front of everyone. He reportedly chose to communicate it through the household, where the order would have to be understood and followed. That meant the next moment would not be another family argument. It would be an instruction. And once that instruction reached palace staff, the balance inside the family would change. The people waiting outside the private discussion would soon discover that Charles had not chosen the obvious solution. He had chosen something far more unexpected. Before that order became known, however, one final question remained. Why would Charles risk upsetting Camilla instead of simply demanding that Charlotte apologize? The answer would not come from a public statement. It would come from what Charles reportedly said behind closed doors. And if this story matters to you, do not let the next revelation pass without taking a position. Subscribe, share this video, and comment if you believe Charlotte should be allowed to keep her own choice, because the next part reveals the decision that made this private dispute impossible to ignore. The instruction was finally given, and it was not the one palace staff had been preparing themselves to hear. Charles reportedly made it clear that Charlotte was not to be pressured into calling Camilla grandmother. The decision was simple in wording, but enormous in consequence. It meant that the palace would not turn a child's personal understanding into an obligation merely to protect an adult's feelings. That was the moment the entire dispute changed. Until then, the issue had been contained inside a private family disagreement. Now it had become a question of principle. Charles was reportedly drawing a line around Charlotte's choice, even though that choice had caused Camilla considerable hurt. For the people responsible for maintaining order inside the household, the instruction created an immediate problem. They had to know exactly what Charles meant. Were they expected to remain silent if Charlotte used another form of address? Should they correct her privately? Should they avoid the subject altogether? The safest interpretation was also the clearest one. Nobody was to pressure the child. According to the account, that message was passed carefully through the household. Camilla was reportedly stunned by the decision. The expectation had been that the situation would be resolved by restoring the customary form of respect. Instead, Charles had chosen restraint. He had not ordered Charlotte to apologize. He had not instructed William to force a change. He had reportedly accepted that the relationship between a child and an adult could not be manufactured by command. That was difficult for Camilla to hear. The title grandmother carried emotional significance. It suggested a place inside Charlotte's closest family circle. Being denied that title, even privately, could feel like being denied a place in the family itself. Yet, Charles's decision appeared to recognize another reality. A formal title can be offered, but genuine emotional recognition has to develop naturally. The palace now had to deal with the consequences. Staff members who had previously assumed that Charlotte should be guided toward the expected title had to step back. They could no longer treat the issue as a simple matter of etiquette. Any attempt to repeatedly correct Charlotte could now be seen as violating the very instruction Charles had reportedly given. That changed the atmosphere around future family meetings. The adults could not simply pretend the disagreement had never happened. But they also could not keep reopening it. Every encounter with Charlotte and Camilla required greater care. A casual introduction could become uncomfortable. A question from a member of staff could create another incident. Even silence could be interpreted. And that was precisely why Charles's order mattered. He had not solved the emotional disagreement. He had stopped the palace from forcing a solution. That distinction is easy to miss, but it sits at the center of the entire story. Camilla could still feel hurt. Charlotte could still hold her own view. William could still support his daughter. Charles could still respect his wife while refusing to control his granddaughter's words. All four positions could exist at the same time, even if they created tension. That is where the account becomes more complicated. The decision reportedly did not mean Charles was rejecting Camilla. It meant he was refusing to make Charlotte responsible for repairing an adult relationship. That was a significant difference. If Charlotte had been ordered to apologize simply because Camilla was hurt, the child would have carried the emotional burden of a dispute she did not create. Charles's reported instruction prevented that. But it also raised another question. Why was Charles willing to make such an unusual decision? If his priority had been ending the disagreement as quickly as possible, forcing a conventional apology would have been easier. It would have restored the expected form of address and allowed everyone to move forward without explaining anything further. Instead, he chose a decision that required the household to tolerate discomfort. That suggested the issue had become personal for him. The account surrounding the incident points toward Diana's memory as the reason. Charlotte's reported insistence that Diana should be recognized as her grandmother had brought an old emotional subject back into the center of the family. For Charles, that could have been difficult to hear. Diana was not simply a name from the past. She was William's mother and Charlotte's late grandmother. Her memory remained part of the family's identity. Whatever feelings existed between the adults, the next generation could not be expected to experience those relationships exactly as previous generations had. That reality may have influenced Charles's decision. The important point is that the story does not require Charles to choose between Diana and Camilla. His reported decision can be understood differently. He could acknowledge Camilla's position while accepting that Charlotte's emotional language belonged to Charlotte. That is what made the order so powerful. It was not a public declaration against Camilla. It was not an endorsement of a family feud. It was a boundary. And boundaries can sometimes reveal more than confrontations. Once the instruction was known, the household reportedly understood that the matter was no longer open for staff to manage. The adults would have to live with the uncertainty. Charlotte would not be coached into using a title simply because it made the adults more comfortable. For William, that would have been a significant relief. He had reportedly entered the dispute knowing that defending Charlotte could create tension with his father and with Camilla. Charles's decision removed one immediate source of pressure. William no longer had to choose between protecting his daughter and obeying a direct instruction from the king. But relief did not mean the problem had disappeared. Camilla still had to process what had happened. The emotional rejection could not be undone by a palace order. Even if she accepted Charles's decision, she could still wonder what Charlotte's words meant for their relationship in the future. Would Charlotte eventually change her mind? Would she become closer to Camilla as she grew older? Would the family simply avoid the subject? Or would the moment remain a quiet reminder that certain wounds inside the family had never fully healed? Those questions were left unanswered. And then the story took another turn. A palace aide was reportedly aware that Charles had made a private admission about the incident. The aide's account suggested that Charlotte's words had affected the king more deeply than people around him realized. The alleged admission was not about anger, it was about memory. According to the story, Charles privately acknowledged that Charlotte's words had reopened a family wound he believed had been buried for decades. That statement changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Suddenly, the order protecting Charlotte did not look like a simple decision about manners. It looked like the response of a man who recognized that the past could still enter the present through the words of a child. And if that account is accurate, Charles understood something that the adults around him may have missed. Charlotte had not created the wound, she had touched it. That difference matters, because when a child speaks about a family member who is no longer alive, the adults listening can hear much more than the child intended. They hear memories, they hear old arguments, they remember decisions, they remember loss, they remember the parts of their lives they believed had already been settled. That may explain why Charles reportedly refused to pressure Charlotte. He could have forced the word, he could not have forced what the word meant. The palace had therefore reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The disagreement could be managed, but the emotion behind it could not be ordered away. And Camilla was now facing a reality that no royal protocol could completely solve. A place in the family could be formal. A relationship had to be earned. For the household, that revelation created a second layer of tension. If Charles himself had been affected by the memory, then the instruction was not merely administrative, it was personal. Staff could follow the order, but they could not control the emotions behind it. William could protect Charlotte, but he could not erase the history surrounding her. Camilla could accept the decision, but acceptance would not make the hurt disappear. And Charles could close the discussion, but closing a discussion was not the same as closing a wound. That was the uncomfortable reality waiting beyond the palace doors. Silence only pushed the real question deeper. The next part would reveal why Charles's private admission was so important. Because once the connection to Diana became clearer, this was no longer simply a story about what Charlotte called Camilla. It became a story about what Charles himself believed had been buried. If you have followed this far, do not leave the story silent now. Subscribe, share this video, and leave your view before the final revelation, because the next part gets even more personal and exposes the family wound Charles reportedly thought was finally gone. The most revealing part of the story was not Charlotte's refusal, it was what that refusal reportedly exposed about Charles himself. For years, the past had been treated as something the family could place behind closed doors. Public life moved forward. Children grew up. New generations appeared. Ceremonies changed, yet one sentence from Charlotte reportedly brought an old emotional conflict back into focus. The alleged admission from the palace aide was therefore crucial. Charles had reportedly acknowledged that Charlotte's words reopened a family wound he believed had been buried for decades. If that account is accurate, his reaction was not simply about protecting a child from pressure, it was also about recognizing that some memories cannot be managed through protocol. That helps explain the unusual decision. Charles reportedly understood that forcing Charlotte to use a title would not change what she felt. It would only change what she said. The distinction may have been uncomfortable, but it was important. A child can repeat a word because an adult demands it. That does not mean the relationship behind the word has changed. For Camilla, that reality was difficult. Her position within the royal family could be formalized. Her marriage to Charles could be official. Her role could be publicly recognized. But none of those things could guarantee that every younger member of the family would experience her in exactly the same way. Charlotte's reported refusal exposed that uncomfortable gap between public position and private emotion. It also showed why Diana's memory remained so powerful. Charlotte had grown up after Diana's death, yet Diana's place in the family had not disappeared. Photographs, stories, family memories, and William's connection to his mother all formed part of the environment in which Charlotte understood her own history. She did not need to have known Diana personally for Diana to occupy a meaningful place in her identity. That is why reducing the incident to a childish disagreement would miss the central issue. The reported conflict was about inheritance of memory. Children inherit more than names and titles. They inherit stories about the people who came before them. Sometimes those stories are complicated. Sometimes adults would prefer to leave certain chapters closed, but the next generation can still ask questions, form attachments, and decide which memories matter most to them. Charlotte's reported words brought that process into the open. William's position then becomes easier to understand. His reported support did not have to mean hostility toward Camilla. It could simply mean that he did not want his daughter to become responsible for resolving the emotional history of adults who came before her. That distinction protected everyone from a larger confrontation. It protected Charlotte from carrying guilt. It allowed Camilla to feel hurt without turning that hurt into a command. And it allowed Charles to acknowledge that his granddaughter's understanding of the family could not be controlled completely from the top. But there was still an unresolved question. What would happen between Charlotte and Camilla after the controversy faded? There was no guarantee that Charlotte would change her mind. There was also no guarantee that Camilla would stop feeling wounded by the refusal. The reported instruction from Charles could prevent pressure, but it could not manufacture closeness. That may be the most realistic conclusion to the entire story. Families do not repair complicated relationships through one order. They repair them through time. They repair them through ordinary conversations, patience, trust, and repeated moments that are never recorded by cameras. If Charlotte eventually develops a different relationship with Camilla, that relationship will have to come from Charlotte herself. If she does not, the adults around her may have to accept that as well. That is precisely why Charles's reported decision carries significance. He could have used authority to settle the matter immediately. Instead, according to the account, he chose to limit the use of authority. That does not erase Camilla's hurt. It does not rewrite Diana's history. It does not prove that every detail surrounding this account is true. But it does reveal the central tension at the heart of the story, the difference between demanding recognition and receiving it freely. And that tension reaches beyond one family. Every parent understands that children notice more than adults sometimes realize. They listen to conversations. They remember names. They absorb family stories. They form opinions from what they see and hear. Trying to dictate every emotional response can create resistance instead of loyalty. Inside a royal household, the consequences are amplified because personal relationships exist alongside ceremony, tradition, and public expectations. Charlotte's reported refusal therefore became powerful precisely because it was so small. One word could challenge an assumption. One child's preference could force adults to confront an uncomfortable question. And one decision from Charles could determine whether the palace treated that preference as disobedience or as part of growing up. The alleged AIDS revelation gives the story its final layer. If Charles truly believed the wound had been buried, then Charlotte's words reminded him that buried does not always mean healed. A family can stop discussing something without resolving it. A public controversy can disappear without disappearing emotionally. Years can pass without removing the weight of what happened before. That may be what Charles reportedly recognized in that private moment. Charlotte did not create the old wound. She may simply have touched a place everyone assumed was no longer sensitive. And perhaps that is why the reported order was so unexpected. It was not a victory for Charlotte over Camilla. It was not necessarily a defeat for Camilla. It was a decision to stop turning a child's words into a battle that belonged to adults. There is another reason the episode continues to attract attention. It forces a separation between public duty and private feeling. Royal life depends heavily on symbols, but families depend on relationships. Those two systems can work together for years, until a personal moment exposes the difference. For Charlotte, the reported incident may eventually become only a distant childhood memory. For the adults involved, it could remain much more significant. A single refusal placed old questions beside new ones. Who gets to define family? Who decides which memories deserve space? And when does respect stop being respect and become pressure? Those questions cannot be answered by ceremony alone. They have to be answered by the people living inside the family. That is why the reported decision carried such unusual weight. It acknowledged that affection cannot be legislated, even inside a household where almost everything else follows rules. Charlotte's choice became a test of whether tradition could make room for individual feeling without turning disagreement into rebellion. That question may outlive the controversy itself for years. The audience is therefore left with a difficult question. Should Charlotte eventually be expected to use a title simply because the royal family considers it appropriate? Or should that relationship be allowed to develop on its own terms? There is no easy answer. Camilla deserves to have her feelings acknowledged. Charlotte deserves room to understand her own family. William has a responsibility to protect his daughter. And Charles, according to the story, found himself caught between those competing responsibilities. That is what makes the reported incident so compelling. The headline sounds like a confrontation between a young princess and a queen, but underneath it is a much more complicated story about memory, family loyalty, grief, authority, and the limits of control. The most important detail is not that Charlotte reportedly refused to call Camilla her grandmother. It is that Charles reportedly decided she should not be forced. And behind that decision sits the alleged admission that her words had reopened something he thought was gone. That is the part viewers should remember. Because sometimes the smallest family disagreements reveal the largest unresolved emotions. If this story made you question whether children should be forced to carry the emotional expectations of adults, do not just watch and move on. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, like this video, and share it with someone who would understand the difference between respect and pressure. Your support helps these stories continue to be examined instead of ignored. And if you believe Charlotte should be allowed to find her own place within her family, without being pushed into a role she does not feel naturally, say so in the comments. One simple comment can make your position clear. The story may end here, but the questions surrounding this family do not. The next video coming to this channel goes even deeper into the royal tensions, the memories that refuse to disappear, and the decisions being made behind the public smile. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because if this story surprised you, the next one gets even more difficult to ignore. And if you stay silent when these family controversies are brushed aside, nothing changes. Your like, your share, and your subscription are your way of saying that these stories deserve to be heard.